Hello, my students. Welcome to Secured Transactions, where we're going to just complete the problems that we were discussing in an earlier Zoom meeting. That is specifically problems 137, 141, and 142, dealing with the sale of collateral. So 137, I'll read it through. Mr. and Mrs. Miller decided to open a restaurant, for which purpose they needed $80,000. They went to Apocalypse National Bank, which agreed to loan them the money if, one, they got a surety, and two, sign an agreement giving the bank a security interest in the restaurant's equipment and inventory, and finally, pledge to the bank additional collateral having a value of $20,000 or more. So it's their choice what they want to pledge as collateral, but it's got to be worth $20,000 or more. So the Millers got Mrs. Miller's father, Mr. Stuhlreher, the chair turner, to sign a surety. And what is a surety? It's a secondary obligor. That's what it's referred to in Article 9. And purpose is to have an obligor, someone to sign the promissory note or whatever the obligation is, other than the original debtor. Here, Apocalypse National Bank did not trust fully in the ability of Mr. and Mrs. Miller to pay back their loan. And so what do they want? They want collateral and they want a surety, someone to sign it so that will be on the hook if the Millers don't pay. Okay, and that was the father, Mr. Stuhlreher, signed it as a surety. Okay. And they signed the security agreement, and they borrowed $20,000 worth of stock from Mr. Miller's cousin, Mr. Layden. That's a nice cousin. The stock was registered in Layden's name, and at the time it was pledged to the bank, but the bank had it re-registered in the bank's name, so that it could easily be sold in the event of default. Of course, that is a method of gaining control, and here it is to become a customer on the account is what the bank is doing. The best way, best kind of control to have. Okay, so the bank did, however, file its financing statement in the appropriate office. Okay. Apocalypse National Bank filed a financing statement in addition to getting control over the stock certificates, the securities. Doesn't hurt to do both. We know that getting control is superior to not having control, but we're also dealing with collateral other than the securities. We're dealing with equipment in the restaurant. So for that, you're going to need to file a financing statement to perfect it. So that's why you have both control and a financing statement. Okay. Subsequently, the Millers borrowed another $5,000 from North Bend Credit Union, which also took security interest in the restaurant's equipment and filed a financing statement. The restaurant then became involved in an unfortunate food poisoning incident, and the business fell off dramatically. The Millers, who were in the midst of a divorce, missed 2 payments on the loan. The bank sent its collection agent, Mr. Crowley, to the restaurant, and he repossessed the assets he found there. Mr. Crowley sent a written notice to Mr. Miller, who he knew was now living in a hotel, telling him that the stock would be sold on the open market, no specific date is given, and that the restaurant equipment would be sold at public auction on December 1st at the offices of Crowley Collection Agency. Crowley phoned Mr. Stuhlreher, the surety, and told him the same thing. He then sent a written notice to Mr. Layden, the stock owner, but the letter came back marked moved, no forwarding address. So, if asked, either Mr. or Mrs. Miller would have supplied Crowley with Layden's new address. Crowley sold the stock for $10,000 on the open market. That was its current selling price, and then auctioned off the restaurant equipment on December 1st for $500. Not a lot. Only one bid was received. Crowley himself was the bidder. He later resold the equipment to other restaurants for $10,000. Crowley turned over the proceeds from the two sales to Apocalypse National Bank, which then brought suit against the Millers and Mr. Stuhldreher for the deficiency. Please answer these questions. Okay. So, yeah, we see that notice is being given by Crowley, who works for Apocalypse National Bank. So Crowley's the collection agent. He's going to go and sell the collateral at an auction. And it gave notice. He gave notice to, needed to give notice to the debtors. That would be both of Mr. and Mrs. Miller. Also the other debtor, Mr. Layden, because although he's not a debtor like Mr. and Mrs. He's not an obligor, let's say that. He doesn't owe the original money, but he is an owner of the collateral. And that is the core definition of being a debtor. We think of a debtor colloquially as someone who owes money, but that is not the definition of debtor in Article 9. The definition of debtor in Article 9 is simply to own the collateral, have rights in the collateral. But the debtor is not an obligor. Those are two separate concepts in Article 9. Obligor is the person that owes the money. The debtor is the person that owns the collateral. Now, typically, those two people are one and the same, right? You owe money and you pledge your own collateral as security. But it's possible to pledge someone else's collateral if they agree to it, like good old cousin Layden here, that's fine. But know that Layden owns the collateral and is therefore a debtor. And now this is the important part. Under 9611, you're required to give notice to all debtors. So that would include not only Mr. and Mrs. Miller, who's the obligor, but also Layden, who's a debtor. Okay, we can look at 611. I can pull it up for you as well, but I'll just read it here that we must send it to the debtor and then the secondary obligor. And so that's why Mr. Layden is going to get a notice for the sale, because he owns the collateral. Okay, so A is a surety entitled to a notice under 9611. Yes, 9611 says that an obligor, including a secondary obligor, and I will share this with you. The secondary obligor must be notified as well. Here we go. Here we are. Secured party shall send authenticated notification of disposition to the debtor, which includes Mr. and Mrs. Miller. They own the equipment in their kitchen. And then also Mr. Layden, who owns the stock. And you also have to send it to any secondary obligor, that is the surety. It's another name for surety. Okay, so yes, you have to send Mr. Stuhldreher, the dad, a notice. He is a debtor, we've talked about that. Oh, is he a debtor? You know, he's not a debtor, he's a secondary obligor. Was Mr. Layden a debtor? Yes, we've talked about that, he is a debtor. Does the oral notice to Mr. Stuhldreher satisfy 611B? No, it doesn't. And where do you see that? If you look at 611B, it says that it has to be a reasonable authenticated notification of disposition. Where else do we see this term authenticated? In 9203B, where you have the elements of attachment requiring an authenticated security agreement. And we know that authentication, if you burrow down into the definition, authenticate means to sign. or adopt a record and or to adopt or accept a record or attach to that record an electronic sound or symbol. This just gets to the broad concept of what signature means. You don't need to put a pencil to paper. You can do it electronically or voicemail potentially. But usually it is to sign. And if we look up the definition of sign, it will talk about a writing. So that's how you get to the requirement for written notice from authentication. Okay. And does it have to be written down? No, it can be an electronic writing or an electronic record as long as it's retrievable. Okay. Back to 137B, were any parties entitled to a notice of the stock sale? You do not need to give notice of stock sale, just as you do not need to give notice of the sale of perishable goods. And that is down here in D, 611D, that B, that is a notice requirement, does not apply if the collateral is perishable, threatens to decline speedily in value, or is a type customarily sold on a recognized market. So if you sell, if you have as your collateral stocks that are sold on the New York Stock Exchange, for example, you do not need to auction those off. You know that you will get a fair market price by simply selling them on the stock exchange because there is constant online auctioning going on on the stock exchange. Same is true of commodity exchanges. If you have pork belly or something else, cotton that's sold on a commodity exchange, no need for notice of an auction. You just go ahead and sell it. Now the same is true for different reasons, but the same is true for perishable goods like strawberries that have been unloaded on the dock and will decompose. If you don't sell them right away, you don't have time to advertise an auction. You don't have time to notify everyone. You got to go to the farmer's market and sell those strawberries. And so you do not have to give notice under those circumstances. So there are two different reasons. One is that if something is sold on a recognized market, you're going to get a fair price. So there's no reason to go through the process of giving notice and holding an auction. And then if you have something that's perishable, on the other hand, you just don't have the time to do it. So you have to go still out and do everything that's commercially reasonable when you're selling those strawberries, but you're able to go right to it and sell them. And then there's another phrase that's it's often read into or conflated with perishable, and that is the kind of collateral that threatens to decline speedily in value. What might that be? I'll give you an example. Computers. And I've had personal experience with this very issue and when working with Apple Computer, and the partner that I was working with wanted me to follow through with the sale of the computers without giving any notice and putting in that time to get notice, schedule an auction. No, because he argued that these are likely to speedily decline in value. You know, they were whatever model Macintosh it was, or MacBook or Super Mac it was. There's going to be another one that comes along in a couple of months that is going to render this one obsolete. And so you better get to selling them right away. And that is how we proceeded. But you can see how that is walking a fine line. How quickly do computers lose their value? Is it so fast that you don't have time to send out notice? That's debatable. But there's an example. Okay, let's get back to, are we, yes. Okay. So if no notice was sent to North Bend Credit Union before the equipment was sold, did Mr. Crowley himself take free of its security interest when he bought the equipment at the foreclosure sale? And yes, takes free. Takes free of, but which, let's see here. So we have Apocalypse National Bank. Which security interests do you take free of them? Because you see, if you look at 9617, go up here to this. Okay, the rights of the transferee of collateral. There we go. What do you do when you buy some collateral at a public auction? What happens? Well, you get all of the debtor's rights in the collateral. So whatever the debtor had, typically it's a outright ownership interest. You as the purchaser at the sale will get that outright ownership interest, and furthermore, it discharges the security interest under which the disposition is made. That is, it discharges the security interest of whatever secured party is holding this auction. And here, who is it now? It's Apocalypse National Bank that is holding the sale. Right, and you're right. And Mr. Crowley is working for the bank. So, and Crowley can purchase. That's okay. He was the only bidder at this sale, so he could purchase the collateral, which is the equipment. And the question is then, does he, when he purchases his equipment, he's going to acquire the title of the debtors, which is the miller's title to this equipment. But does he take free of all these security interests? And the answer is yes. He's going to take free of the Apocalypse Bank security interest, and that is in A2, but then also in A3, it will discharge any subordinate security interest. So if there's any secured party that's subordinate to Apocalypse Bank, then Mr. Crowley will take free of their security interest as well, which intuitively you and I understand. If you go and you buy something at an auction, you're going to get it, and you're going to take free of the security interests of the secured party that sold it. You're going to take free of that, and you're going to take free of any junior secured parties if there are any other secured parties in the picture who are subordinate to Apocalypse National Bank. And here we have one such party, North Bend Credit Union. So it's subordinate because they had a security interest in equipment. There's no indication that they have a purchase money security interest, so they're just a regular secured party, and they were the second to file or perfect, so they are going to be subordinate, and Mr. Crowley's going to therefore take free of their security interest as well. Okay. There's a question here about entrustment 2403. That's another argument you can make, that you take free of the security interest is through this concept of entrustment. That is, when someone is under 24031, if someone has possession of goods and holds them out for sale, they are able to sell, and they've been entrusted these goods to hold, they're allowed to sell the entire interest in those goods. For example, here's an example. If you go to a watch store, which also not only sells watches, but repairs watches, and you entrust them, you give them your wristwatch to repair, and they repair it, and then they put it in the display case and sell it. Even though you didn't give them permission to sell it, They were entrusted with it, and the person that bought it is going to be able to take it free of your ownership interest. And that's a similar argument that could be made here. If someone has custody of collateral and sells it, then you get clear title under the entrustment rule. And that's Article 2. You can file that away in the back of your mind. But the Article 9 rule is very clear. That when you buy something at an Article 9 auction, you're going to take free, the buyer will take free of the security interests of that secured party and all security interests of subordinate parties. Okay, is the notice sent to Mr. Miller sufficient as to Mrs. Miller? And problem there is that they were recently divorced, or they're going through a divorce and they've separated, they live in different places. Is it sufficient just to send one notice to Mr. Miller, or do you have to send two? And it's really, there's nothing in the statute that says that, except you have to be commercially reasonable in every respect, including to whom you send notices. So it's good practice, of course, to go ahead and send them twice so that you're sure that they both get notice. Okay. What if the notice is returned, which is the case here with Mr. Layden? The address was bad. Do you have to now, you get the notice back, do you have to now do some research and inquire into where Mr. Layden moved and send him yet another notice? You can imagine this could be time consuming, especially if you have hundreds of debtors or other secured parties to notify. And again, the courts will say, take reasonable efforts to locate. If it takes a phone call and you've only got this one secured party, junior secured party to, or your debtor, the owner of the collateral, to notify there's a few people involved, yeah, make some extra efforts. That would be wise, and a court might decide that you really are required to make extra efforts. Okay, if the restaurant equipment is also named as collateral in a junior filed financing statement, must the bank notify that secured party of the resale? Oh. Of course, you've got to notify all secured parties that have a financing statement on file within 10 days of the notification date. So you'll want to of course, do that search, maybe using the 20 to 30 day safe harbor. But if you discover another secured party, then yeah, you're going to give them notice, absolutely. Who has the burden of proof as to the commercial reasonableness of the sales? This is interesting. Now we're getting to the question of, what if the secured party is not acting in a commercially reasonable manner? Whose burden is it to prove that? And how will that litigation proceed? And that is detailed quite nicely in Article 9.626. Action in which deficiency or surplus is an issue. So what we're looking at here is how does this arise? Typically because the debtor or a junior secured party is not happy with the amount that was realized at the auction, which was of course organized by the senior secured party. There was an auction held, let's say, but the amount garnered for this restaurant equipment was just $500. That seems pretty low for professional restaurant equipment. So the question is, what do you do? What do you do if you're a debtor and you think that that amount was too low and that it was not conducted, the sale was not conducted in a commercially reasonable way. What do? Well, you sue under 9626 for for an improper deficiency, basically. Because what the secured party is going to do is say, so here we're owed $80,000. The secured party went out first and sold the $20,000 in stock. That was easy. But now it has what, $60,000 of an outstanding obligation, and so it repossesses the restaurant equipment, organizes an auction, sells it off, only makes $500. Now what? Well, they're going to sue the debtor, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, for $55,000 for the remaining deficiency. And that is when Mr. and Mrs. Miller would sue. We'll say, hey, $500, there must be something wrong here, and then start exploring how the auction was carried out in an effort to prove that it was not done in a commercially reasonable manner. Why would a junior secured party sue? Well, it could be that, imagine that restaurant equipment is highly collectible, first-rate, vintage equipment. Beautiful gas stove and all kinds of wood-burning pizza oven and Indian tandoor oven, and they're worth a lot. They're worth $100,000, let's say. And the senior secured party here, Apocalypse National Bank, they're only owed $50,000 at this point. Well, $60,000 at this point. They were owed $80,000. They sold $20,000 in stock and took that. They're only owed $60,000. Now, if they go and sell this very expensive, very valuable equipment for just $500, that means that there's certainly nothing left over for me as a junior creditor. What I want is for that Apocalypse National Bank to do everything in a commercially reasonable way so that you would get a reasonable market price for this vintage equipment, which maybe could have raised $100,000 purchase price. And if that were the case, if it had sold for $100,000, then Apocalypse National Bank would have just taken their $50,000 or $60,000, and then there would have been $60,000 they took. There would have been $40,000 left for the junior creditors to divide up amongst themselves. So that's why you can get complaints. You get a lawsuit from either the debtor or the secondary obligor for the same reason, because if he doesn't like the secondary obligor, Mr. Stuhldreher, doesn't like the way the auction was carried out, and now he's on the hook if the Mr. and Mrs. Miller don't pay, then he will be on the hook to pay the remaining, $55,000. He's not going to like that too. He's going to want to make sure that the sale was done properly so that this obligation is paid off from the proceeds of the collateral. So for any of these people, the debtor, the surety, the junior secured party, they all have an interest to make sure that the sale is done properly and as much money is realized as possible. And if they feel something was done wrong, this is where they head. Let's turn to the text. 626. Where do we start? In an action arising from, might as well start from the beginning. In an action arising from a transaction other than a consumer transaction, but in fact, we'll see, because consumer transactions are dealt with in B, but it turns out that in Ohio, there is no B, there is no A, there's just the text from A, so all of this stuff, and it applies to both consumer and business transactions. So in Ohio, this is deleted, this phrase, and it just reads, In an action arising from a transaction in which the amount of a deficiency or surplus is an issue, the following rules apply. One, this is the first step, a secured party need not prove compliance unless the debtor or a secondary obligor places the secured party's compliance an issue. That is, going to court to enforce a security interest. Let's say you need to go to court. You don't have to prove that you as a secured party do not initially have the burden of proof. You don't have to prove that you're commercially reasonable before you go out and carry out the enforcement of a security interest. You only receive the burden. You're only required to explain yourself if another party, that debtor, secondary obligor, or junior secured party, if they put you on the spot, if they claim that the deficiency was insufficient because you did not conduct the sale in a commercially reasonable manner, and then it's your turn. And here we go. So you're not initially carrying the burden, but if it's placed an issue, then you have to prove. Here we go. If the secured party's compliance is placed an issue, the secured party has the burden of establishing that the collection, enforcement, disposition, or acceptance was conducted in accordance with this part, which of course primarily means commercial reasonability. So if a secured party fails to prove that the collection, enforcement, disposition, or acceptance was conducted in accordance with this part, so if the secured party fails to prove that it acted in compliance with Article 9, then the liability of a debtor or secondary obligor for a deficiency is limited to an amount by which the sum of the secured obligation, expenses, and attorney's fees exceeds the greater of, and here's the calculation. So if it turns out that you didn't follow Article 9, you didn't provide, let's say, sufficient notice of the auction, then how do we now recalculate the deficiency in that light? And this is how you do it. The liability of the debtor will be limited to an amount by which the sum of the secured obligation exceeds the greater of. So now you want to look for the greater of one of these. The proceeds, the actual proceeds, or the amount of proceeds that would have been realized had the non-complying secured party proceeded in accordance with the provisions of this part. So, how do you recalculate the deficiency? Well, let's go back to this kitchen equipment. Let's say it's a very expensive vintage equipment. It's worth $100,000, and he would have gotten $100,000 if the secured party Apocalypse had acted properly. So what does 626A3 tell us to do? It says, first pick the larger number. Is it the number that was actually received, the proceeds actually received at the sale, $500? Is that the bigger number, or is the number that you would have received if you had done everything in a commercially reasonable way, Apocalypse National Bank? What would that number have been? Well, it would have been $100,000. Okay, which is greater, $500 or $100,000? It's $100,000 is greater, obviously. Okay, now we take that because it asks us here to figure out the greater of, and usually it is when you're talking about a deficiency that's too high because the sale price was so low. It's going to be the second one that's going to be higher, typically. So what do you do then? You're just going to subtract this number, that $100,000, from the secured obligation, along with any expenses and attorney's fees. So in this case, if let's see, we owed, what do we say, after selling $20,000 worth of stock, we owed $60,000. If this had been properly done, we would have realized $100,000. And so 60,000 minus 100,000, it wipes out the obligation. So in that case, the deficiency would have been recalculated to 0 rather than, what was it, 50,000 minus 500, so 49,500. Okay, so that's how you recalculate the deficiency. Basically, you use the number that would have been realized if a proper sale had been carried out. And that's the number you use, rather than the actual number, which was the result of an improper sale. Okay, let's keep reading through here. It's not quite done. For purposes of 3B, the amount of proceeds that would have been realized is equal to the sum of the secured obligation, together with expenses and attorney's fees, unless the secured party proves that it's less than. So this is nice. This is saying that once you tee this up and you say, okay, we're going to take the larger of the actual proceeds, or the proceeds that would have been realized if you had acted properly, we're going to take the larger one of that. What this does, section 4 is saying that we're going to assume that if everything was done properly, the amount of proceeds would have equaled the outstanding obligation, unless the secured party can prove otherwise. So what this is basically saying is that if you break the law, secured party, if you do something improper when conducting a sale or any kind of enforcement of Article 9, it will wipe out the obligation and the debtor will owe you nothing. Because we're going to assume that if you had done everything proper, then you would have made an amount of money that's equal to the amount owed, and that would wipe out the debt. So that is when the burden now shifts to the secured party. And the judge is going to say, okay, we're going to wipe out your debt, secured party, apocalypse. Unless you can prove to me that if you had done everything right, you would have received something less than the full payout amount. If you can convince me of that, then I will go with that amount that you convince me of. And then maybe I will rise up and say, oh, Your Honor, if we had done everything right, it would not have realized 100,000. If we had done everything right, Your Honor, we would have at best realized $30,000. And if they convince the court of that for whatever reason, good. And then the court's going to go with that and say, okay, we won't wipe out the debt. We are convinced that you would have realized $30,000, and so we're going to use that number, and we're going to reduce the deficiency owed from $49,500 to $20,000. So let's see if this adds anything of a deficiency of surplus. As okay. All right. So to summarize, 626. The secured party does not have to prove initially that it complied with Article 9. But if a debtor, a secondary obligor, or a junior secured party challenges them, then the secured party has the burden to prove compliance with Article 9. If it turns out that the secured party did in fact violate Article 9, then we are going to assume that the amount realized upon a proper sale would be equal to the amount owed, and therefore would wipe out the debt. Unless you, secured party, can convince me that you would have received less than that amount. And then we'll recalculate the deficiency, but there will be some deficiency at least. So that is the approach taken by 626, and it this is referred to as a rebuttable presumption. There's a rebuttable presumption that the amount that would have been realized upon a proper sale equals the amount owed. And that rebuttable presumption applies, this whole analysis applies both to consumer transactions as well as business transactions. Okay, so there's an overview. Let's get back to here. Okay. All right, who has the burden of proof? All right. Gee, if Crowley had given the equipment sale no publicity, has a public sale occurred? And if so, was it commercially reasonable? Now, I would argue that that is not a public sale. If you look at the comments of 9610, you will see that 9610, you will see that the whole concept of a auction, a public sale, is to have a true auction, and an auction has to involve adequate advertising so as to allow a meaningful opportunity for competitive bidding. Right? What is a public sale? It's an auction. And what is an auction all about? Getting as many bidders there as possible to compete and drive up the price that's going to be realized on the sale. So if Crowley had given the equipment no publicity, is that a public auction? Well, no, I think by definition, it's not a public auction, but you don't always have to have a public auction, a public sale. You can have a private sale. So Mr. Crowley can still argue that he didn't violate Article 9 if he can argue that it was commercially reasonable not to have not to advertise. I don't know exactly what that argument could be, but that would be his challenge to argue that. Maybe that there are no newspapers that target this demographic, so there's no place to advertise. Maybe it's just word of mouth. You'd have to do something to show that it was okay and that it was reasonable not to advertise. Another approach that he could take is, you could say, you got me. I didn't advertise. And you know what? I know that it says that I'm required to advertise to have a public sale. So my bad. However, I asked the court not to alter the deficiency or recalculate it at all, because I posit that even if I had complied with the letter of Article 9 and I had aggressively promoted the auction, I posit that I would have received the exact same amount, that it would not have changed the outcome of the sale. And if he could prove that, then under 9626, Mr. Crowley could get away with not promoting it by arguing that it was commercially reasonable. And commercial reasonability is the ne plus ultra, is the ultimate question when you're dealing with the enforcement of security interests. So that would have to be his argument. What would that be? I guess along the same lines where I was going earlier, that no, even if he had placed a bunch of ads in newspapers, no one who is in the business of buying used restaurant equipment would have read the newspapers. You'd have to make some kind of argument. I'm not saying it's a winning argument, but you have to make some kind of argument like that and convince the court. Okay. Last sentence here. When a secured party repossesses goods and sells them in a foreclosure sale, will this give rise to Article 2 sales warranty been made to the purchaser at the sale? And the answer is absolutely. Looking at 610 here, and I trust you're all doing the same. That's 609, getting close. Yep, 10. A contract for sale, lease, license, or other disposition includes the warranties relating to title, possession, quiet enjoyment, and the like. All right, so yes. And it was an open question in secure transactions. Alexa just responded, funny. It wasn't an open question in secure transactions for a while is, do you get all the warranties of title, warranties of merchantability when you purchase something at an auction, Article 9 auction? And courts have gone back and forth on that, saying you shouldn't get all the warranties. You know that it's likely that there may be an issue with respect to the title, but new version in 2000 of Article 9 did away with all that mischief and just made it explicit that if you buy something in an Article 9 sale, then you get all the benefits of Article 2. That's when you just purchase goods in any other situation. So you do get a warranty of title. So if it turns out that that someone has better title or security interest, then you'll be protected and can sue under the breach of the warranty. And brings us to the next question, which is 141, where we'll see this warranty of title come into play. So know that, first of all, that yes, you do get warranty of title when you purchase collateral in an Article 9 sale. Okay. All right. Problem 141. Facade Motors granted a security interest in its inventory to Octopus National Bank, which duly perfected by filing a financing statement in the proper place. Right? Facade Motors, what do they have? They have inventory. Cars on the lot. And they borrow money from Octopus National Bank so they can buy their inventory, and they give Octopus National Bank a security interest in that inventory. And then Octopus National Bank files a financing statement, and you might say, Professor Sundahl, this is outrageous. We all know that you can't perfect a security interest in a certificate of title collateral by filing a financing statement. You've got to indicate it on the certificate of title. And I'd say you're right. Once the automobile leaves the lot. But while the car is in the lot, the new car on the lot, it's treated not as certificate of title, but as inventory. Because we don't want Octopus National Bank to have to indicate on every certificate of title that it has a security interest in it. Rather, they just file one financing statement, and as long as the new cars on a lot are treated as just inventory, perfected by filing a financing statement, and you got it, it's an enabling loan, purchase money security interest in that inventory. Now, what happens when you sell that inventory off? Of course, it's inventory that's been sold to a buyer in the ordinary course of business. Buyer in the ordinary course of business takes free of that Octopus National Bank's security interest in the inventory. Okay, so that's kind of background. So the Octopus National Bank is financing their car lot. Subsequently, Facade Motors granted an identical security interest to Night Flyer Finance Company to get short-term credit. When Facade failed to repay the second debt, Night Flyer repossessed the inventory and sold it. Must it somehow account to ONB for the proceeds of the resale? Does the buyer at the resale take free of the security interest of the senior? How can the resale creditor make avoid making a warranty in 2312, which is the warranty of title. And remember this, that a warranty of title under 9312, Article 2, sales of goods, when you sell something, you make a warranty that you own it, that you have title to it. So if it turns out later on that it's stolen, the buyer can sue you and say, hey, give me my money back. The cops just took my bicycle that you sold me. But in addition to making a warranty of title, you're also giving a warranty that no one has a security interest in the item. So when you're selling this, selling the restaurant equipment, that's here, we're done with restaurant equipment, with the cars in the car lot. You are giving a warranty first that you own the cars and that no one has a security interest in. So that if someone buys the car, maybe they're not a buyer in the ordinary course of business, so they take subject to the security interest. If it turns out then that that secured party swoops in and takes the car from this regular buyer, then it would be able to sue the car lot for breach of the warranty of title because there was an outstanding security interest that resulted in the loss of the car. And now you can sue for breach of the warranty of title. So, all right, I just want to kind of review that. So we have these two creditors, Octopus National Bank, and we got Night Flyer. They both have a security interest, a perfected security interest. Let's assume in the inventory. When Facade failed to repay the second debt to Night Flyer repossessed the inventory and sold it. Now, can a junior secured party do that? Yes, any secured party can. Upon default, you've got a right to enforce it. You can start the process of selling it. You can repossess it. But typically, it's the senior secured party that's going to do that. We'll see why as we go through this. But theoretically, you have the right. Night Flyer has the right, yeah. Must it somehow account to ONB for the proceeds of the resale? No, it does. As is after the sale, doesn't have a duty to account to this, to Octopus National Bank. Does the buyer at the resale take free of the security interests of the senior creditor? No. And that's the punchline of this problem. The junior secured party has the right to go ahead and initiate the sale of the collateral. But remember, a person that buys collateral at a Article 9 auction purchases it and takes it free of any security interest created by that secured party that's organizing the sale, as well as any other subordinate secured parties. You take free of all of it. So what you really want is, you want as a buyer, you want to be purchasing from the senior creditor, because once you purchase from the senior creditor at an auction they organized, then you take free of their security interest and everyone else, as everyone else is subordinate to the senior secured party. So that's optimal. Because if you go to an auction that's organized by a junior secured party, as is here, this is what happens. That you'll buy the car, let's say, and you will take free of the security interest, Night Flyer security interest. Let's imagine they've set up an auction. They've got these cars on the lot that they repossessed from the dealer. And you go to this lot now and see these repossessed cars, and you purchase one. You are going to take free of Night Flyer security interest, and you're going to take free of anyone that was subordinate to Night Flyer's interest. But you do not take free of Octopus National Bank's interest. The senior secured party security interest will continue, just like any other sale, will continue in the hands of the buyer. And so Octopus National Bank would be able to repossess that car from my driveway after I bought it. Now, I would be surprised, assuming I didn't know about this stuff. I'd be surprised. I just bought this car. I have a warranty of title from Night Flyer. And so I find out that Octopus National Bank has a senior security interest and has repossessed my car. And they have the right to. What is my right? Well, just to sue Night Flyer for a breach of the warranty of title, because there was someone out there with a valid security interest that then came after my car. So I would just sue Night Flyers for the purchase price, and that's how it would roll, and that's how it would work out. And Octopus National Bank would seize my car and sell it at a separate auction. And then that buyer would truly take it free of all security interest because it's buying it from a senior secured party. Okay, now, so this is how kind of the Article 9 sale with the right of the buyer to take free of security interests interfaces with the warranty of title. Okay. And how this final question on 141, how can the resale creditor avoid making the warranty? Well, you have to. It's almost impossible to disclaim it. Very hard, but you have to just do so very explicitly in writing. I recommend, well, it doesn't have to be, make a very obvious disclaimer that and if you take an Article 2 class, you'll know that it should be extremely explicit, such a disclaimer. And it should say something like, the buyer of any goods at this auction may not acquire clear title to the goods and may be subject to a suit by a senior secured party. Something explicit to let that buyer know that if they're buying this car at this auction, they may face a lawsuit from Octopus National Bank. But anything short of that, it's very hard to avoid that. So that's the reason why you wouldn't want to move forward with this sale a Night Flyer, because it could just turn out to be a pain if you go and repossess cars and then you sell them, and then Octopus National Bank goes and repossesses those, and now you're facing a flood of warranty of title claims. Better to just let the senior secured party Octopus move forward with the sale. And hopefully they do everything right. You watch them closely as Night Flyer. And then if they do everything right, there's a chance that there may be some proceeds left over for you. And just as the Octopus National Bank as a senior secured party would have the right to go after that automobile in the hands of the buyer, the Octopus National Bank could also go to Night Flyer and assert a security interest against the proceeds, whatever money they received when Night Flyer sold the cars off at their Article 9 auction. So, it's another reason why you may not want to do it yourself as the junior creditor, because anything you get from that sale, the senior secured creditor is going to take from you as proceeds. So that's enough on 141. Let's wrap it up with 142. And this is about Porsche Moot. Facade Motors repossessed the car that Porsche had used in a law practice, but failed to send her any notice of the foreclosure sale, which brought only half the amount she still owed on the car. May it still sue her for the deficiency? Yes. Yeah, of course. What are Portia's rights? Well, if they can sue her for the deficiency, but the question is, of course, what are they going to get? What are Portia's rights? Okay, well, she can sue for statutory fines under 625, which is worth looking at. And 625 has certain statutory fines. That is, you just get a flat penalty for certain violations. But of greater application is 625A, I believe. Oh no, B. It just says that a person is liable for damages in the amount of any loss caused by failure to comply. And then there, so if you can prove loss due to failure to comply, you can sue for damages, absolutely. And then you'll see in 625C are the statutory damages, for example. I'm looking at E now too. E, if you fail to comply with Section 208, 209, 509A, it's the filing of a financing statement. And the one that's come up before is, yeah, if you file a financing statement without getting consent, or either implicit consent through a security agreement, that's a violation of Article 9, and it's a statutory violation. You can get $500 per financing statement. So if you have someone that is trying to terrorize you by filing unpermitted financing statements, you can make a little money. Okay, at least set them straight. But what else can you do? You can sue also for any damages that result, and it would be in this here. It'd be in the context of 9626. Portia would say, "Hey, you violated Article 9 in this sale. You didn't give me, the debtor, notice." And what is Facade Motors going to say? They're going to say, "Yeah, you know what? We didn't, but it doesn't matter. Even if we'd given you notice, we would have sold it for the same amount." So they would have to prove that. They can't just say that in a conclusory way. They'd have to prove it by saying, you know, if we had informed you, there's no evidence that you would have advertised it yourself to increase the amount realized on the sale, nor would you have bid in on the sale yourself because you have no money. And so it's no harm, no foul. So if they can convince the court of that, then there'll be no readjustment. There'll be no adjustment of the deficiency. But if they're not able to convince the court, and if Portia said, "Hey, if I'd gotten notice, I would have brought all my classmates and family and really tried to push up the competitive bidding so that you would have gotten as much as possible so that I, Portia, would have to pay as little as possible." That's just a question for the court to decide. And again, as I mentioned before, there is no 9626B in Ohio. The analysis is the same for both consumer and non-consumer transactions. So, as always, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in our next class.